right, so welcome to Roots Variety Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Charles Wheelan, who is a senior lecturer and policy fellow at the Rockefeller Center at Dartmouth College, a former correspondent for The Economist, a former congressional candidate, and author of various articles and books, including a New York Times bestseller called Naked Statistics. And lastly, Dr. Wheelan is also the founder and co-chair of a political organization called Unite America. So, Dr. Wheelan, thank you for joining me today.
It's good to be with you.
So, just starting off, how did you first get involved in public policy work?
I was fascinated by what I now recognize as public policy, but didn't then.
Okay.
Which is to say, as an undergraduate, I would think about like, what are they fighting about in the Middle East? I was an Asian studies major with a focus on the Middle East, and I kind of want to peel back the layers on that onion, but I was simultaneously interested in First Amendment issues and immigration and apartheid in South Africa. And what I realized, what they have in common is they're all public policy questions. I formally got more interested because I took a gap year after college, spent a year traveling around the world writing stories for a small newspaper called the Valley News.
Okay.
And they said, just write about what you want to write about. And over the course of that time traveling, I wrote about water quality in the Ganga River. I wrote about death penalty for drug traffickers in Singapore. And I realized I kind of look back and like everything I wrote about is public policy. So I followed my interests, and we would now describe all of that as public policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So yeah, there's a logical track towards that path.
It didn't always feel logical, but when you look backwards at it, it was more or less logical.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when did you first start to think about political polarization? Obviously, that's a big topic that you're involved with today.
It took me a lot longer to start thinking about political polarization. I thought a lot about politics because you can't really or shouldn't really be in public policy without thinking about politics, because that's how we do it.
Right.
My first job was writing speeches for the governor of Maine, who was a Republican at the time, Jock McKernan, married to Olympia Snowe, who has since become more famous because she went on and ran for the Senate for Maine. I was acutely aware then of political ideological differences, which is not the same as polarization. And I hope we can drill down on that. Just people have different worldviews.
Yeah.
As a Republican, I do remember McKernan constantly feuding with the right wing of his own party. Like in terms of headaches, the Democrats controlled the House. I can't remember who controlled the Senate. So he was always negotiating with the majority leader, who was a Democrat, but he was also fighting off his own party, who he considered to be just the lunatic fringe. And so I was aware of those dynamics and how it played out. But it was before we became polarized or hyperpartisan. And the way I describe that is that we won't find common ground even if it exists. What I remember from McKernan is you and I come in, we disagree on 80%, we do a deal on 20%, we go home, and then we do the thing the next day.
Yeah.
Hyperpartisanship is, okay, I know you agree with me, but I'm not going to give you a win. And I think that's a much more dangerous and self-defeating place to be.
Right. Yeah, it does seem like that has become more the common path now, where no matter what, give nothing. And it's all about us versus them mentality. And so when was the first time that you decided, like, okay, this is a serious problem, I need to get involved with it, and I need to figure out, okay, what we can do to make it better?
A couple of strands came together. The first, as I told you, I'd been a speechwriter for a Republican. That was in the late 80s. Obviously, the Republican Party changes, gradually from the 80s on, but Jock McKernan was a New England Republican, which is kind of the breed that's been more or less hunted to extinction. You still have Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, formerly of Massachusetts, and so on. But so the Republican Party is kind of moving. And many years later, in 2008, I ran for Congress in Chicago in the special election after Obama was elected. He appointed Rahm Emanuel as chief of staff. Rahm was my congressman. That created an opening. I ran the special election. I did that not because I recognized there was a partisanship problem, but I realized that there was a governance problem. We were then in the depths of the financial crisis. I was somebody who wrote routinely about economics and taught public policy. If there was ever a time to get involved on the political side to do the things that I've been advocating, that was it. So that was when I felt motivated to actually become engaged in the political process. Now, when I ran as a Democrat in a Democratic primary in Chicago and realized that while the Republican Party had moved away from me, it was also true that I could not win in a Democratic primary for a bunch of reasons. Around that time, my wife was becoming a charter school teacher. She had been a software executive, and you literally can't win a Democratic primary as a pro-charter person, even in a city like Chicago, where so many children are being poorly served by the public schools. At that point, I realized, okay, I'm not at home in either party. And still, I didn't think we had a partisanship. I didn't think it was that dangerous. I just realized that we had a missing middle.
Yeah.
Now, as an outgrowth of that missing middle, I would argue the partisanship has grown worse as people either join Team Red or Team Blue and they drift apart. But I think it was a combination of having been a Republican, having run as a Democrat, not being at home in either party and feeling fairly close to the center, and meanwhile teaching public policy. This is the last piece, and watching healthcare move away from us, climate change move away from us, the fiscal situation move away from us, infrastructure move away from us. Everything I was teaching was getting worse by virtue of not doing things where I felt you could find a lot of common ground. So it was the combination of all those things that led me to write the centrist manifesto, which in turn led indirectly to the founding of Unite America.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I think probably most people would, kind of relate to that. Because it doesn't appear that I think many Americans really think that, oh, I want the most sort of polarizing candidate as my option, the person who makes the loudest sound bites, that gets trending on social media. I think people really don't appreciate that overall, but I think that a lot of people probably aren't too comfortable talking about it in this environment, because it seems like you're either on one side or the other, and there's not really any middle ground. Do you kind of get that impression, teaching at a university and working with Unite America?
I think I want to put a finer point on something, which is to say that the ideological disagreement is not only okay, it's really great.
Yeah.
If you've ever been on a functional school board or corporate board where there may be somebody who has fairly extreme views, but is committed to the well-being of the organization, that's great. I remember being on a school board in Chicago, and there was a guy he was kind of cranky in the meetings, but he was actually a really nice guy, and he was very fiscally conservative. He just did not like to spend money. So we'd say an idea, and Walt would say, I don't want to spend money on that.
Yeah.
But we were better as a board by virtue of hearing from Walt, because he'd say, like, here's a way of doing it cheaper. We'd be like, let's do that. Or he'd say, this is just wasteful and there's no evidence it will work. And we're like, Walt's kind of right on this. And in other cases, we'd say, Walt, this is where we should spend money. And Walt would say, yeah, and if he was willing to spend money on it, it was a really good idea. And so we were and there was nothing personal about it. I think most of us would say we were very grateful that he was on the board, because sometimes he was saying things we weren't willing to say. But, he was as committed to the health of that high school as everybody else. And that's what's missing. It's not the disagreement. It's that the disagreement cannot be harnessed in the same direction. We can't use that creative tension to make us better. Instead, it completely paralyzes us.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of almost reminds me of the divide that you have seen off and on between like the religious community and the science community over things like evolution, where for many it can be like, oh, it's either white or black, no middle ground. But I have seen, I think in recent years, there's been more interest in scientists trying to work to sort of bridge that gap a bit and communicate things without it having to sort of interfere with people's beliefs. And it seems like the political parties, to a certain extent, have developed into almost religious-like groups.
And I would say that there's an element of intellectual dishonesty that has crept into it as a result of the partisanship. I might, if you want a more facile example, compared to like Red Sox and Yankees fans. That when there's a close play at first base and it's a Red Sox runner, they're all like safe. Yeah. And the Yankees are all like, he was out. Like, we're all watching the same replay, but you are seeing objective reality through a lens that has now made you not objective. And of course, now imagine throw in Fox News and MSNBC that we're watching different camera angles. Where they've cherry picked the angle for the Boston fans. Like, look at this, he's clearly safe. And the New York ones are seeing a different angle, and we'd all be better off if we saw all the angles.
Yeah, it's much more like a sporting event now, where it's like, okay, whatever it takes for the team to win, whatever it takes for us to get elected. But in terms of working together and stuff, that's kind of a secondary thing.
Exactly.
That's yeah. Well, now another thing that I was interested in talking about, because I know that you are kind of a numbers guy. A lot of your work is about statistics and probability. To what extent do you think the lack of understanding for basic probability and statistics affects polarization when it comes to the general public?
I think it affects a lot. And it's not just numbers, because I would actually describe myself as a numbers guy who's bad at math.
Okay, yeah,
I
fair
think
enough.
it's often a poor understanding of the underlying concepts.
Right.
An example would be trade-offs. It's ironic that in our private lives, we totally understand trade-offs. I'd like to live in a 9,000 square foot house, but I don't have $1 million, so I'm
Right.
not going to. Or in this market, that would probably be $10 million.
Yeah.
It would be fantastic to have a private plane, but I don't because my kids need to go to college. Like, we do that all the time. I would like to have ice cream for breakfast, but I don't want to gain 10 pounds. In the public realm, when people discuss their ideas, I often listen to the political debates on the Republican Democratic side. And when people put forth their ideas, they never talk about any trade-offs. Like, yes,
Yeah.
this is great, but it's also going to cost $1 trillion. Or,
Right. Yeah.
this is terrible. Well, yes, but it would also make this group way better off. And the reality is that every decision we make in the public realm has trade-offs. If it's great for us, it might be expensive. If it's expensive, it might still be worth doing.
Yeah.
And we're just not good at understanding, kind of holding two truths at once, that yes, it might be worth doing, but we're going to have to sacrifice something, even as we're pretty good at doing that in the private sphere.
Yeah. And to what extent do you see political parties kind of manipulate data to try to use it to their advantage for things? Obviously things like just COVID-19 has become very much politicized.
Yeah, so I think there's this toxic marriage of partisanship and the intellectual dishonesty that I mentioned, and just plain hard issues where there are going to be trade-offs that leads to really lousy outcomes. COVID presented a whole bunch of them. We should have been wearing face masks very early on. I think, those on the right downplayed the clear benefits of that, just kind of cherry picking evidence, even though it's a relatively small sacrifice in the grand scheme of things. We probably also should have kept more of our schools open. I think the left still is wildly naive about the damage that we did to a cohort of children, particularly poor children who fared worse in an online environment. So that would be a classic example where in real time, the science was giving us the answers and the two sides were cherry picking the answers they wanted because they'd already dug in on what they felt we ought to do.
Yeah.
And so the information kind of bounced off, which is really a lousy way to confront public challenges.
Yeah, that's I guess kind of heart of the problem, is that as we have talked about multiple times now, it all goes back to just people not willing to see things from all perspectives, and as you said, the trade-offs of each decision we make. I think there's always a balance that you can have when it comes to policy, that you try to mitigate the issues that result from a decision, but it seems like it's not something that people care about right now who are making the policy, or at least there's not enough people that do care about it.
Yeah, I often get really angry at people who espouse a point of view that I agree with.
Yeah.
And I would get mad at them because I feel like the case they're making is incomplete or disingenuous. So I am in favor of a carbon tax. But if you don't also point out that it can be regressive and that's got to be ameliorated somehow, then you're not telling the complete story. I read a magazine article last night about immigration. I am pro-immigration within the constraints of the law.
Right.
And the person who was making the case said, look, immigrants don't replace jobs, and that appears to be true. They create demand so that the pie grows. That also appears to be true. But this person failed to neglect that immigration imposed disproportionate costs on certain geographic places. So if you are a school district in South Texas or a police department in Southern California, because you are receiving a disproportionate share of immigrants, your social services are more expensive. Now, immigration is good for the country as a whole, but you've got to acknowledge these geographic disparities, because then, like the carbon tax, you can help them. You can say, look, we want to be more pro-immigration, but we need to send federal funds to school districts that are most adversely affected by, for example, kids who don't have English as a first language. Welcome to the country, but you know what? We've got to spend federal resources to spread out the costs that are associated with something that we think is good in the long run.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it, because when you have things that are morally sound policies, like, okay, you want to help fight climate change, you want to allow for legal immigration. But if you're doing policies blindly without looking at, as you said, again, the trade-offs, then you can get situations where you're actually hurting people that are in communities that, you know, are dealing with climate change because your policy is not totally sound about dealing with all the aspects of it and the complexities of it. Same thing with immigration. You know, you get all this anti-immigration sentiment when there's lots of people that, you know, could be coming in and being implemented in the system and just working out just great. But you get this backlash because it's so just one-sided. Let's not look at the consequences of actions.
Yeah, and I think both sides are responsible for kind of demagoguing that issue. The reality is you do have to control the border in some way. That's kind of part of the compact that we've created as a society. Creates all kinds of logistical problems if you don't.
Right.
On the other hand, the data on the economic benefits, social benefits, cultural benefits of having a more diverse population are quite clear.
Right.
So what we need to do is sit down and figure out how we can harness everything that's good about immigration, which is a ton, while acknowledging the fact that there are particularly some short-term costs, that there are probably some things we need to do to help folks become more comfortably ensconced in the mainstream. And that's not incompatible, by the way, with welcoming immigrants. It just means that if more people speak English, it'll be much easier to build a coherent society. It'd be much easier for those folks to thrive when they're here, those kinds of things. And those are the discussions, back to where we began, that usually take place when you've got a functioning democracy with a range of viewpoints who are committed to coming up with some coherent immigration policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just shifting focus from, you know, sort of the politicians making policy to the general public, you know, what do you make of the seemingly increasing trend of people not trusting experts when it comes to, you know, important pieces of information, whether it's pandemics or climate change or even just policy issues like you know, immigration?
I think this is a socially devastating development. I was actually teaching this morning about reasons people disagree with each other, and number one is just a difference in worldview. Like, we may disagree, you and I, about whether life begins at conception. There is no right answer, and no amount of data is going to dislodge that view. The morality of capital punishment, like a whole bunch of those issues that are just philosophical disagreements born out of our lived experience, our faith, what have you. But then number two is just factual disputes. You know, what was the name of Tom Petty's first album? Like, and I was, you know, because I'm old, I was telling my students, you know, we couldn't Google that back in the day, so people would just keep arguing about it. You know, I said, look, if it's Googleable, then it's just a factual question. But now we've moved into a realm where people say, well, yeah, but what was your source on Google? We've actually moved backwards in terms of being able to look to some established body of evidence. And I think experts fall into that category. You know, if my general practitioner says this causes that disease, then we're all going to believe that. So I think that's a very pernicious development. It means that kind of our collective sense of truth has been damaged. I think the fact, this goes back to the Red Sox Yankees example, that we're now going to turn on different television channels and they're going to give us different facts, it kind of cleaves us apart and makes us less capable of dealing with some common body of knowledge. So I think it's a very, very dangerous trend. And it's married, by the way, to decreasing trust, not just in experts, but in our fellow citizens. So trust that other people, social capital, will do the right thing is really, really important. And that appears to be eroding based on our current partisanship.
Yeah, it appears that it just become sort of a society with lots of hyper tribal people that don't have any interest in someone that doesn't believe in the same things or doesn't follow the same websites. And I think that's a problem that I'm not sure how they're going to fix it without some type of education system that I guess puts more thought onto helping children analyze that.
Boy, I don't know. I've actually assigned that to my students. I've said, come up with a solution for the fake news problem. And the papers were well written, but there were no great ideas. I mean, this is one, it's a tough one.
Well, yeah, because it's I guess you'd be kind of having to deal with this balance of, okay, you can't obviously really censor things without that becoming an issue, because then, you know, what are you allowed to censor, which could be a problem, especially if someone's just has a differing opinion on things, and then to what extent is that opinion
Yeah, I
dangerous or
think
not?
part of the solution is going to have to come from people sanctioning members of their own tribe. Like
Yeah,
we're at the point, you know, if I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, and you say something objectionable or demonstrably untrue, and I criticize you, no one's going to listen to me because I'm
right.
probably criticizing you for things that you say that are true,
Yeah,
right? I just,
that's
you know, I
right.
get up. What did Ben
Yeah,
say today? Oh, time for me to disagree with it.
right.
Ben's still an idiot. He was an idiot
Yeah,
yesterday. He's an idiot tomorrow.
that's right.
What he's going to
Tweet,
say on
tweet.
Tuesday
Yeah,
will be untrue. Like, you know, I don't know what it is, but
yeah,
Ben, you know,
yeah.
so it's much more powerful if you and I are in the same party and I agree with
Right.
you. And then one day I'm like, you know, Ben, he wasn't right on this. Like, here are the data. I like Ben.
Yeah,
I agree with Ben. And then people are like, whoa, right? You know, so that
right.
means Democrats criticizing President Biden. It meant Republicans criticizing President Trump. That was always more powerful.
Oh yeah,
Um,
sure.
and happened far too infrequently. There was certainly in the Trump case, there were many opportunities when he did things that were demonstrably untrue.
Yeah,
I don't think Biden does things that are untrue. Maybe have policy ideas that are not optimal. So I think the
right,
Democrats can
right.
help there. But Trump was in his own league in terms of untrue. And I think part of the obligation of being a citizen, particularly someone in a position of power, is sanctioning your own, particularly when they say
Yeah.
something that's either beyond the pale or demonstrably not true.
Yes, I mean, having these politicians by nature often make misleading claims, whether intentionally or not. But having your party hold you accountable to a certain extent makes a big difference, especially with the people that are diehards for that political party. I imagine that for people that are of a certain age, it's harder and harder to filter or understand what's online. I think maybe there'd be more hope for generations coming up, you know, being exposed to the internet at a young age, and if in classrooms they're being educated about, okay, you know, how do we determine sources, you know, what makes someone an expert, uh, you know, is it going to be some
Yeah,
guy with a blog or actual person with a
right. Some
degree,
guy
you
in
know?
his parents' basement with a
Yeah, that's
blog.
right.
You know, I think we have to remember how relatively new the internet is. I
Yeah,
mean, you know, I'm not that old. I graduated from college, and there's no internet at all, let
yeah,
alone and when it did come along, by the way, and this is a lesson in and of itself, everyone was very optimistic about how it was going to improve the flow of truth and
yes,
knowledge because there would no longer be the choke points controlled by a relatively homogenous group of news sources. So this was, you know, I don't remember anybody warning that this would be bad for democracy, bad for shared truth, or what have you. That was
right.
really an unintended consequence. Nor, not to get too far afield, were people aware of the damage that social media might do for young people. It now appears, you know, we are in the midst of a mental health crisis
Yeah,
for people who are in college. The students I deal with routinely, we're still trying to figure out what's going on, but it's likely that social media, the way that it replaces personal interaction, the bullying,
yeah,
uh, those kinds of things are likely contributing to this mental health challenge.
sure.
So we kind of went into social media the same way we approached X-rays in like the 1950s. You know, I was not alive in the 1950s, but if you look back at old photos and stories where people would go to the shoe store and someone would X-ray their foot to see how big the shoe was because they had no knowledge of the
Yeah,
radiation damage, or go to
right,
the
right.
fun house and have your X-ray taken, see your skeletons. Like, you know, then only later do we realize, like, oh my God, this is, you know, this is dangerous for people, and now we have lead shields. Well, presumably the next generation of social media users, the next generation of parents, will put some parameters around it, and the companies will act more responsibly, and we'll have more information, and we
Yeah,
can deal with it more effectively. But effectively, we have just lived through the wild, wild west of the internet,
yes.
of cable news, of news as entertainment, and of social media.
Yeah, I do wonder, and I kind of get the impression that since there has been a little bit more regulation about trying to get people who are, you know, borderline, you know, extremists off of the internet, I guess social media companies who have not been doing a good job historically have started to do more. And it does seem like to a certain extent people who do have these really, really aggressive viewpoints don't get as much benefit from just talking to people that are exactly the same. It's not as exciting. And so going on these like kind of really far out there websites where you can chat with your friends isn't quite the same as being able to really basically battle people on a social media platform. So maybe that is helping a little bit, but
there's no easy solution here, because we're at the intersection of talking about trade-offs. The First Amendment, which I think is crucial. I've lived in countries where there was not the freedom of expression. You watch what happens in China and Hong Kong, and it's very alarming.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And meanwhile, we've got abundant research showing that it's very important for us to read dissenting views, even really quirky views. On the other hand, we also have research that people who are spouting conspiracy theories are doing enormous damage in the face of COVID vaccine resistance and other things. So somehow we got to reconcile all of those truths into some policy that allows us to manage this very powerful force that is the internet. And we are just kind of groping blindly towards solutions, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. And I suppose that, I mean, the appetite for conspiracies right now is at a really high point, and it's gonna be hard to get rid of that for a while, because basically any new thing that happens, there's gonna be people out there that are going to be promoting, these sort of counter ideas that are really kooky. So
yeah, and to come up with one example where arguably both sides acted somewhat irresponsibly, if you think about like the Wuhan virus theory, that the virus leaks from the Wuhan facility, and we still don't really know what happened there, but part of the reason, so Trump starts calling it the China virus and so on, and it's kind of like the parable of the child crying wolf. He had told so many things that were untrue,
right,
that the left in particular, the media kind of reflexively, every time he said something, he's like, no. Well, this one, we still don't know what the truth is, but certainly the media dismissed that prematurely when there was at least some credibility. It's worth looking into. And so what's the problem there? Well, the problem is we had a president who was repeatedly saying things that weren't true. And then we had a media that now got in the habit of, if Trump said it, it's not true, which does not follow naturally from that first statement. And then the effect is, wait a minute, remember the Wuhan virus? New York Times said that wasn't true. I'm not trusting the New York Times. And we have now exacerbated this cycle of not trusting mainstream news sources, trusting now every conspiracy that comes along might be the Wuhan virus. So that whole thing is a microcosm of how the situation continues to spiral in a way that feeds on itself.
Yeah. I mean, there almost should be, obviously could be challenging because politicians like to speak off the cuff a lot, but it'd always be best almost if we just have, just let the science experts come out and give an update on things without the political interjections, which just distract from the problem. But yeah, that is an interesting example, and we'll continue to see how that all plays out as more things come out in the situation. Now, how did you come up with the idea for Unite America?
It has evolved over time. As I said, I wrote this book called The Centrist Manifesto, which originally argued for the creation of a political third party in the middle. The idea was you get these two parties moving apart. Presumably, they've left a vacuum in the middle that might be filled by Republicans who are disaffected with the direction of the Republican Party, Democrats who are not progressive. They would have more in common with each other than they have with their current political party. Now, I still believe that to be true. I still believe that there's an important political middle. I just think that the structural reasons, the strength of our tribalism, there are a whole bunch of structural factors that make that unlikely, not least the fact that most of our elections are first past the post. So if you run a third party, there's a chance that you're a spoiler and you could have an unintended effect. So people tend to stick with the two parties. We tried running independents in 2018. We could not get them elected, even in this polarized environment. So what we then pivoted to, it used to be the Centrist Project, it became Unite America, is changing those incentives and those electoral structures in a way that provides an incentive to be less partisan. So one very powerful example is we are big supporters of ranked choice voting. And we gave significant resources to get ranked choice voting passed in New York City, where they just held their first mayoral race. We don't yet have a winner. That's one of the drawbacks. You could automate it to the point where you get an instant winner, but they're not there yet. But it appears to have worked, first of all, fairly seamlessly. People understand it, where you kind of rank your choices.
Right.
But also, again, we don't have a winner, but it appears that Eric Adams is going to win. He certainly was a big leader in the first round, and he was one of the more moderate candidates in the race. So if you have just an open primary and it's first past the post, a fairly extreme candidate could get elected with 27% of the vote or 31% of the vote. Ranked choice voting means that the final winner will ultimately have to have a majority, and it provides an incentive. If there's a whack job in the race that you really like, you rank them first, and you rank your different whack job first. But we both pick Eric Adams as our number 2 choice. So when the whack jobs have been eliminated, Eric Adams wins. Right. And both you and I are going, yeah, he's okay. I would have preferred this, this communist or this libertarian. I'll settle for Eric Adams. Meanwhile, Eric Adams this is a less or a more subtle impact, has an incentive to be very kind to other candidates, which is not the incentive in a normal race. So there may be a libertarian running who's got some important points. There may be a Green Party candidate who has no chance of winning, but has some ideas about climate change that are kind of popular. And a mainstream candidate might say, I think Ben's a lunatic, but here are 3 things I agree with him on.
Right.
And people say, all right, well, Ben's still my number 1 choice, but it looks like this other guy shares some of Ben's beliefs, so he's my number 2 choice, which means that there's a kind of a healthier ecosystem for adopting other ideas. You and I can't be really mean to you, or I will never be the number 2 choice of all your followers. So it changes both who gets elected, but also how they behave, and then what issues they endorse. So we're focusing on ranked choice voting, open primaries, anti-gerrymandering, and those kinds of things. And we can talk about why I think gerrymandering contributes to partisanship, but our current mission is nonpartisan, which is in some cases, this will benefit the Republicans, in some cases, the Democrats, hopefully some new political competition, but things that we think are institutional changes that allow us to better map the preferences of the voters onto the politicians that they get and the way those politicians behave once in office.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the concept of ranked choice voting, because when you're looking at elections, this is one of the most important things that a society does. And you want it to be a process that is complex because it's appreciating how important it is. And to have a process where you can allow for, some lunatic to get elected just because the other candidates split the vote, that's not accepting the complexity and the importance of the situation. And so it's good if more would embrace ranked choice voting or other methodologies that allow for people to have more options and to make sure we get the best candidate possible.
Yeah, and the other one is our primary system is ridiculous in way. It's one of these things you just kind of take for granted. It's kind of like the way we've become about homeless people in the United States. So you just pass them like, of course, those are the homeless people. Like in the late 80s, people were still appalled that there were Americans living on the streets, and we're just kind of used to it. But
it's ridiculous.
Like we shouldn't be used to it. It's a hard problem to solve, I will tell you that. But we should never, ever be used to it.
No,
and
absolutely.
I feel that way about the primaries. Like the primaries, okay, Team Red will go off and pick their candidate. Mind you, they may only be 8% of all voters, and they are the most rabid of the Republicans. And meanwhile, Team Blue will go off, and they're 7% of the population, and they are the most left-leaning. And they will come back, and they will produce relatively extreme candidates that are out of sync with everybody in between. But that's all we get to choose from. And the example I give is, imagine a student council election in a high school where the band nominates one candidate and the lacrosse team nominates another. And that's who we get to choose from. And you're like, neither the band nor the lacrosse team is representative of the school. Why are those the only 2 people we get to choose from?
Right.
I think so. Closed primaries are a disastrous idea. They contribute to the partisanship because of who they produce. We were heavily supportive of the referendum in Alaska that went to open primaries and then ranked choice voting in the general, which means that all candidates run in one primary. The top 4 candidates, they could be 4 Republicans, they could be 3 Republicans and a Democrat, they could be 2 Democrats, a Republican and independent, but they all then advance to the general election, and that is determined by ranked choice voting.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Hopefully, more states pick that up and get interested in it. Now, I do want to, I guess, touch upon that a little bit more, as well as you mentioned gerrymandering. How concerned are you about the growing supermajorities in state legislatures?
It concerns me because it means that healthy dissent that we talked about is missing.
Yeah.
And I'm talking to you from New Hampshire, which is quite an electorally competitive state, but I'm originally from Illinois.
Yeah.
And I would probably describe myself, I'm politically independent, but ideologically I'm kind of center left. So I'm probably more ideologically aligned with the Democrats in Illinois than with the Republicans. And yet the Republicans the Democrats have had too much control. And as a result, there have been long-running supermajorities. And as a result, the state is in a fiscal dire shape. There are a lot of policies that don't make any sense. The public schools didn't open in Chicago. So that would be a case of a Democratic supermajority where I think it just hasn't worked to the benefit even of people who share the Democrats' ideas. There just hasn't been that. I referred to Walt. There hasn't been that guy on the school boards like, we can't afford this. We shouldn't do that. It won't work. So that concerns me. And of course, the Democratic supermajorities among Republicans, they're just some bad ideas that become law. So for example, if you remember Kansas, there were big proponents, I forget the governor's name, that if you cut taxes, you would generate more government revenues, right? So
Governor Brownback.
Some rare cases where that's true, but usually if you cut taxes, you get less revenue, surprisingly. So Kansas does this experiment. If they called in any mainstream economists, they would have said, yes, if you cut taxes, you'll get less revenue. And if you want small government, that's fine. But if you cut taxes, you can't spend more. So they went ahead with this experiment, and shockingly, revenues fell off a cliff and their schools were inadequately funded. And I think if there'd been an honest Democratic opposition, they would have said, hold on here. This isn't going to work the way you think it's going to work. So I don't particularly like any supermajority. On the other hand, it's clear that when neither party is a supermajority at present, they're not very good at governing.
Yeah, that's the other issue. That's right. I mean, it's actually funny that you mentioned Kansas. I'm originally from Kansas, and I remember being around state government there and people dealing with the effects of the post-Governor Brownback years.
Yes, Brownback. Thank you.
And people on both sides were just like, oh my gosh, this is such a mess.
And of course, if you're really politically dishonest, you say, well, we just didn't cut taxes enough.
Right.
They go, that's like telling somebody, if you stand on the roof and believe you can fly, you can fly. They jump off and they land on the ground. It's like, you didn't believe you could fly. You can't disprove that, but it is idiocy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and just looking at, when you look at the different state legislatures around the country, it is concerning to me where, you can find some where they have like a Senate that has one person from the other party, or a House that has 100 more members than the other party. I mean, it's just insane. You almost wonder if like some parties are going to go extinct in some states if it keeps going, but it's crazy.
There are a couple interesting developments here. If you look at the most popular governors in America, they are of the opposing party in a state dominated by the other party. So Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. Well, Massachusetts is as blue as it comes, and they keep electing Republican governors, moderate Republican governors. Why? Because I think voters are saying, look, I'm on Team Blue, but I kind of like Team Red in there just to
balance
keep
it out,
people from going nuts.
Larry
Hogan in Maryland, another very blue state. He was, I believe, the most popular governor in America. Again, not a Trumpy Republican, but still very much a conservative. And I think people are like, hey, just look after things while Team Blue is in there. And then in Vermont, just across the river from me, you have Governor Scott in a state. Vermont's Vermont. I mean, that's just You say Vermont, and people understand what you're talking about. And Vermont, but very few people. If it were a trivia question in Arizona, very few people would get it correct. That Vermont consistently elects Republican governors. Now, and there are probably some examples going the other direction, but fewer, I think. I guess if you use the Senate, I think Joe Manchin might be an example of a Democrat in a very red state. But I think it's interesting. I think people are expressing the preference for at least having some input from the other party.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's always been a characteristic of American society is that, again, I think that most people want someone that is a little bit more balanced than some of the more radical, polarizing candidates. And which is why, because also what tends to happen, like if you look at Kansas, Kansas put up Hobach as a potential candidate governor who was then beaten by a Democrat. So Kansas, though, in a state that is very Republican, now has a Democratic governor. And you can see, as you're mentioning, that people want to be a little bit more balanced. Like they might be conservative or they might be liberal, but they don't want to go too far over the edge.
Right. And unfortunately, the primaries, I mean, this is where I think we come back to both the primaries and to gerrymandering. Both of those things lead to more extreme candidates and more extreme candidates winning. In the case of gerrymandering, people are aware of part of the problem here, which is you get these legislative districts that look like a metastasizing cancer. They don't have any geographic sense to them. But what people don't realize, and they know why they're doing that, the Democrats are trying to get Democratic control. If you're in a blue state, the Republicans do it to maximize their representation. But what people don't realize is once you've drawn a safe district, the only way that person will ever lose is in a primary to somebody from their own party, which means they now have a very strong incentive, if they're Republican, to go as right as they can, or if they're Democrat, to go as left as they can, because that will avert a primary. When I was growing up, the word primary was not a verb. Oh, we're going to primary him. What are they going to primary this person for? For working with the other party, for being moderate on an issue, for getting something done, right? Well, those are not really the virtues that we want to be discouraging with our electoral system. So both the primaries, where you've got a rarefied group of people selecting the candidates, and the effective gerrymandering, I would argue, lead to more this choice between more extreme candidates in the general election.
Yeah. And when it comes to Unite America, then how has the public reception been to your organization?
It has been good, but quiet. I mean, people, including the media, like the horse race kind of coverage. We're so conditioned to team red, to team blue.
Yeah.
Even as you look at the Gallup poll, the largest and fastest growing segment of the American electorate are independents. There are more independents than there are Republicans or Democrats. Right. It's usually like 42 or 43%. So if you do the basic math, there should be 42 or 43 independents in the Senate. There aren't, but we're so conditioned. It's kind of like Stockholm syndrome to think of the two parties that people focus on the personalities. What did Biden do? What did Romney do? What did Mitch McConnell do? It's kind of like the way we cover sports. And it's kind of boring, even if it's significant, to say, well, what's the incentive of this electoral system? And ranked choice voting is kind of hard to explain. And so I think the media is somewhat lazy. I think the causal connection is harder to make. But among people who understand it, like a light goes off. And they get it very quickly. I'll use an example from Alaska. They passed by referendum the open primary system I mentioned with ranked choice voting in the general election. As soon as that happened, I mean, within hours of that, a little light bulb went off in Lisa Murkowski's head, and she realized that she would never have to run in a Republican primary again. She might have to win an election, but every election she runs in will now be all Alaskans. Not just the small group of Republicans who are way more conservative than she is. And within days of that, she became much more critical of things that Trump was doing and much more willing to work with Democrats. And it wasn't because Lisa Murkowski was a radically different person. It was that the electoral incentives in her home state had changed in a way that I would argue liberated her to be the senator she wanted to be. Now, people have made that connection. The Atlantic wrote about it. But that's a pretty arcane political story. It's just a lot easier to talk about today's fight between Schumer and McConnell.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people take for granted, I think, how much, some people in a party are just kind of censored by their own party to a certain extent where they can't say as much because their political power is, I guess, at risk if they do. So, having ways to liberate candidates to actually be themselves is another thing that would probably be much better off.
Well, and you and I were talking before you started recording about how thoughtful and intelligent former politicians often can be.
Right.
And part of that is because we've just taken away this perverse incentive system. Nobody's going to tweet about you. Once you're out of office, nobody really cares about you. So you're going to get caught in some tweet storm because of something honest you say. You might compliment somebody from the other party. You might criticize your own party. You might say something about an issue that you were afraid of saying before. And you just get this kind of nuanced view. I mean, I'm always struck by how thoughtful and interesting and kind-spirited, public-spirited that former politicians are. And I just asked myself, well, where was that when you were in office? Because it really would have been constructive.
No, absolutely. I mean, from my experience talking to former politicians, they all have been, very nice and, down to earth. I think a lot of people kind of look at politicians as these, almost kind of hyper-partisan robots, that don't really get it. They're out of touch, but a lot of them do understand it, but they're also playing within the constraints of the political game they're wrapped up in, which can make it harder for them to be themselves. Also, what's interesting is that how many of them talk about how disgusted they are about how much politics has changed today, how much more polarized it is, and they would say like, oh, I used to have lots of friends who were on the other political party. I used to go out to dinner with them. And now I don't recognize what's happening today.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of that. I'm here in New Hampshire, a very small state. Everybody knows everybody. In my class last term, I had both the former governor and former senator come to class just because it's New Hampshire.
Yeah.
So I've spent a fair bit of time with Judd Gregg, who's a former governor and former senator. He served 3 terms in the Senate. And he talked at great length about his affection for Ted Kennedy.
Yeah.
Now, Judd Gregg is a very conservative in a kind of New Hampshire way, kind of a, fiscal conservative, doesn't talk much about the social issues. And what he said about and really he said one of his best friends was Ted Kennedy, because I think they were on the finance committee together. They sat next to each other. He even knew Ted Kennedy's dog's name. And he said, what he really enjoyed about Ted Kennedy was that Kennedy was there to legislate. And while he was at times the most liberal member of the Senate, he really wanted to make the world better. And Judd Gregg said that's why he was there, although he didn't feel that bigger government always made it better. But when there was alignment, then he and Ted would write a bill together. And when there wasn't, they'd say, yeah, we don't agree on that. And he'd pet the dog and they'd go out to dinner. And I thought that was very old school. And I think part of the reason Judd was talking about that is that has passed. A lot of that was pre-social media and so on. And, in some ways they were reminiscing about a time gone by.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad because a lot of people, especially people who've grown up in this era now that we're in, that just don't recognize a political system like that. Not that everything was perfect, in the past, obviously, plenty of issues, but the people willing to work together from different political parties openly and it being common and being friends. It's sad what's happening today because, the past shows that doesn't have to be that way.
And there's some crazy things that I share with my students. So for example, and I may be missing one or two, but for the most part, this will be directionally correct. The last piece of major legislation that was passed with significant numbers of votes from both parties was either No Child Left Behind or the Patriot Act. And arguably the Patriot Act was exceptional because it followed from 9/11.
Right.
And after that, you get things like the Affordable Care Act, which is passed with almost no Republican votes. You have the Trump tax cuts, no Democratic votes. Dodd-Frank, after the financial crisis, that had maybe 1 or 2 Republican votes. You look to the era before that, and here's the amazing one. Bill Clinton gets welfare reform passed, and there are more Republican votes in the House than Democratic votes. So just imagine Joe Biden passing something with more Republican votes than Democrat. Like your head would explode.
Yeah, good luck. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yep. Things have changed. So
we'll see. I mean, the infrastructure bill could change that. I am very heartened by what we've seen in the Senate. And in fact, the book I referenced earlier, the centrist manifesto, explicitly argued for something that I called the Senate fulcrum strategy, which would be 3 or 4 or 5 senators in the center. I wanted them to start their own party, but it doesn't really matter.
Right.
What's important is that they're willing to face down their critics from the flanks of their own parties and work together. And what I pointed out, which is what we're seeing, is you kind of run the world if you've got 5 votes in the middle of the Senate, because the president needs you, the House needs you to get things passed. And we're kind of seeing that in this block that's shaping up, with Manchin holding off the Democrats, demanding Republican support, and then Murkowski and Romney and others joining on the Republican side. If they can get infrastructure passed and signed, I would love to see them just turn their attention to the next big issue. In my optimistic moments, which are fleeting, that's what they look like.
Yeah, I mean, if there can be, kind of a trend being set for people to come together, I mean, even if people are on the polarized ends of the spectrum, like, having some people work together at least a little bit, is such huge progress from what we were at, because people typically don't want to work together on anything anymore.
Yeah, and you may want $3 trillion of infrastructure, but you know what $700 billion is? A lot more than zero.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
I think there are a whole lot of problems where $700 million is better than zero. And criminal justice reform, climate change, like half a loaf, a quarter of a loaf, 2/3 of a loaf, as opposed to 0, 0, 0, 0, which is kind of what we've become accustomed to.
Yeah. Take what you can get. I mean, geez. So what do you think right now is the hardest challenge for your organization, Unite America?
I think our hardest challenge is to persuade people to pay attention, to look away from the shiny objects, and to focus on what I said earlier, which is rational politicians, thoughtful politicians, intelligent politicians are doing things that are not intelligent, not thoughtful, because that's what they're being incentivized to do. To take a more holistic view of the system and to understand something like ranked choice voting, which is not obvious at first how it works, that if you change that, you will get different outcomes, including maybe new political parties. Because once you have ranked choice voting, the spoiler problem goes away.
Opens
then
things
you
up.
might actually get some political competition. There might be team red, team blue, team purple, team green, team white, team black. And then we're going to get a much more fertile environment, again, without the spoiler effect. Then it looks like the New York City mayoral election, which was healthy in the sense that those candidates were saying a lot of different things, very substantive, about schools, about policing, a lot of flavors of policy. And then it rolled up, I would argue, in a direction, again, if Adams wins, that led to what feels like a consensus decision. So I think that's a challenge. I think it's a huge challenge getting people who are not accustomed to thinking about politics re-engaged. One of the most frustrating things I hear is when somebody who's wealthy or well-educated, successful in other realms of life says, yeah, I'm fed up with politics. I was like, okay, well, then what's the alternative? Like, you don't just get to drop out of democracy.
It's
unless you want to move to some small island and put a fence around it and create your own nation, you got no choice. Like, that's I describe it as the dumbest thing smart people ever say. I don't believe in, I've got cancer, but I'm done with chemotherapy. It's really uncomfortable. Okay, well, I'm telling you, the alternative here is not good.
Well,
and we've had some success here, but I think there's a lot more room for business leaders and other persons of influence to appreciate that investments in the political process are probably the most important thing they can do. We've actually coined a term, political philanthropy, which is to say that people of great affluence in the past built museums, they built universities, they built parks, and that was all terrific. But if you are a person of influence now, you need to fix the infrastructure of democracy. That will be the contribution that will have the most impact on your grandchildren. People are not accustomed to that. Politics is sullying. If you build an aquarium, no one's going to cast aspersions on you and say you're a terrible person. But if you do something political, then you run that risk. You also run that risk of losing. If you support a referendum in Alaska that you think is important and it doesn't pass, then you get nothing. If you build an aquarium, you're always going to get the aquarium. So this idea of political philanthropy, engagement by people, formerly we would call them the elites. That's a pejorative term now, but if you hark back to John F. Kennedy, to whom much is given, much is expected. I still believe in that. And that group has kind of checked out of politics because they think they're above it or beyond it. And I just don't think that we can create a giant gated community for the affluent and the privileged. So
Yeah.
I think the big picture challenge is engaging folks in the process to make it better.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And it's good that someone's actually trying to do that as well, because there's not a lot of organizations, seems like right now, that are really trying to combat the toxic political system that's going on and trying to make it better. So that's great. And thank you for doing that, and everyone at your organization, because it's necessary.
Well, it's fun to have somebody who's interested in it.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people would be interested who are not interested already, just because they haven't heard of it or whatever. Trying to get these ideas out there are important for people, because so much is just kind of spreading the concept, like, it doesn't have to be this way.
It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, that is probably the most trenchant thing you can say, as simple as it is.
Yeah.
We don't have to have primaries like this. We don't have to gerrymander. We don't have to have just two political parties, right? And so I think if you can imagine something better, then you can create something better.
So one of my last few questions I have for you: what advice do you have to Americans who are, really fed up with the political system? Maybe they don't even know if they should vote, or if they do vote, they're like, I just hate this so much. What can they do to make this better? Or even to expand it for those internationals listening, anyone who's fed up with the political system anywhere in the world, what can you do?
Yeah, I think the first thing is an attitudinal piece of advice, which is you don't have the luxury of giving up. Right? Like, the patient is in the ER, not doing well. The ER physician can't walk out and say, I'm done with this. Like, then you're going to get cold blue. So you have an obligation to engage in the process. And the more influence and privilege you have, the more obligation you have to do something to make it better. Second, I think, and more tactically, I would say engage at the local level. Local politics, with some exceptions, school boards and the like. We're seeing that with critical race theory. And so for the most part, local government does not have the luxury of being hyperpartisan, because you got to fix the potholes, pick up the trash. There's just so much that has to happen, plow the streets, that isn't partisan. And if you're not doing it, they're going to vote you out. So I think that's the arena where we should be training people. Get together in a room. You got to solve a problem. You have a fixed amount of resources. You benefit from having a diversity of views. You cobble together a solution, then you move on to the next issue. That's the best training ground for what Congress should look like. I mean, if I could hand pick candidates for Congress, I would take them not from Hollywood, not from the governor's ministry. I just take them from school boards. Give me somebody who's worked effectively on a school board for 20 years, and I bet they'll be a good legislator. Right? School boards, for the most part, don't even have political labels. They do have differences of opinion, which is great, but there's not team blue and team red. Again, some places have been contaminated. So get involved locally. And then I think the last one is do what we do everywhere else in our life, which is dream of something better. Right? That's what entrepreneurs do, which is, here's a problem. I'm going to come up with a solution. Now, you're not going to get rich by being a political entrepreneur, but there are political entrepreneurs. I mean, I would consider what we do to be entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, the difference between me and Jeff Bezos is about $1 billion.
A little difference.
Still, but it's still really important to realize that you can be innovative in the public realm. And I would encourage people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's their society. You make what you want of it. You have influence. You're here right now. What are you going to do about it? Otherwise, you just kind of sit on the sideline. You can't really say anything. So,
and I'll give you an example of that kind of entrepreneurialism. Colorado created a very elegant vote by mail system before COVID. And before Trump, when voting became so partisan, it had widespread support. It was entirely secure. It increased turnout. People loved it. And that was just, hey, we can do voting better. And people liked it. And of course, then, that's an example of when you throw the kind of the partisan flavoring into an otherwise savory brew, it just completely ruins it. But that's an example of people doing elections better. We can do campaigns better. We can probably even recruit candidates better. And so on. So I would encourage people to be entrepreneurial, to dream of something better and then do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just wrapping up, what are you currently working on? I know you have a new book that came out recently, and how can people keep up with you?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm an avid fiction writer now. So I wrote The
Awesome.
Rationing, a novel in 2019 about an international pandemic. Now, do the math. That's a year before COVID hit, in part because I think public policy is great grist for fiction.
Yeah.
I have a book on writing that comes out in about 9 months. I finished the manuscript for that. I'm just beginning a book on artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Similar to Naked Economics and Naked Statistics, and kind of demystifying what it actually is, clarifying that your smart toilet is actually not very smart. But the artificial intelligence has the capacity to do great things and also terrible things, and knowing the difference will be important. And I'm continuing to write fiction. So you can look for another novel
Awesome.
and some short stories as well.
Perfect. Perfect. And what's the best place for people to keep in touch with your work and see what you're doing?
I am at charleswheelan.com is kind of the place you can go and see everything that I've got going on.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to talk about these things. I obviously think that they're interesting. You think they're interesting. I hope we've convinced other people that they're interesting.
Hope so. All right.